As I said earlier, I have been here, I think, many times before, I get to say, and I know I had these readings before. I think it might have been, I keep looking at Andrew, was it 4 years ago or 6 years ago? But I remember these readings before, and I got to unpack the Lord's Prayer for you. Any of you remember that? Okay, no one does. I understand. I could have done it again, and you would have been none the wiser. But, and it's incredibly important. Obviously, we have 3 commands from our Lord when it comes to how we worship and how we pray. Baptism and the Lord's Prayer and the Eucharist. And those are the 3 elements of Christian worship that fully reveal to us the nature of God as Trinity and welcome us into the life of God as a verb, active in the world, praying to the Father as His children to be used by the Holy Spirit. That was a brief synopsis of what I said. Any of you remember it now? Okay, so I am not the only one who needs to worry about incipient senility. So I gave that before. So this time, I thought I would take on the Sodom and Gomorrah story, Genesis. Because I'm telling you, there is nobody in any church these days in mainline Protestantism talking about that reading, except maybe me. But I think it's a powerful reading for us because it raises a great question that is very real, I think, honestly, for many people these days, in our country, in our world, in our culture, when you think about kind of how pagan our culture has become, how self-centered and ugly, really, in many ways. And, contrary to Christian morality in many ways. And that is, how do good people function? How do we find the courage to be good, to, turn these words we say into actions for God in a culture, in a world that is increasingly wicked? I see you're nodding. I'm not offending you yet, but that's really true, isn't it? And I remember facing this many years ago when I was an undergraduate, and I was doing my thesis on Jan Smuts and in South African history, and the fall of the United Party in 1948 to the Afrikaner nationalists and everything horrible that happened after that, and. But I got to go to South Africa and visit it when, apartheid was still going on. And I grew up in Washington, D.C., and in my childhood, the civil rights movement was happening, and segregation essentially had fallen in my part of America. And so I was interested to see, how good people could function in what I perceived myself from my own perspective to be, and it's always easier to do this relating to somebody else's country than our own, functioning in an essentially evil society, or a society with a lot of evil laws that you had to kind of follow if you weren't going to get in trouble with the government. To give you an example, if you were a white man driving on the road in South Africa in those days, and a black woman was walking on the road, you couldn't pick her up and carry her in your car. It would have been against the miscegenation law, and you would have been arrested. I mean, that's how apartheid functioned. So even sort of basic Christian decency was not allowed across racial lines. And I was, struck by all the wonderful people I met and who had served with Smuts and his government, a lot of them English South Africans. I met with Alan Paton, who wrote Cry, the Beloved Country, an incredible visit. And I was really struck by, there were really a lot of very good white people in South Africa who knew what was wrong and wanted to change it and lived good lives themselves as best they could, but it was a challenge and a struggle for them. And then many years later, once I became headmaster of St. James, I was visiting in China. And this may have been about 10 years ago. And I had a particular family that was very excited to invite me to Dalian, which is up in north of Shanghai on the ocean. And I remember this host, and we were on I guess a friend's yacht, and we were coming out of the bay into the Pacific, and he told me I had to hide underneath because they were watching, and I couldn't go beyond a certain line. He was going to take me beyond a certain line. It was sort of typical kind of creepy situation that you get over there. And we were going out, and he asked me a really interesting question. It was interesting. He asked me this when we were on the boat away from where anyone could hear us. He said, you know, you're a priest. He said, and I'm a businessman in China, and I really can't function without giving bribes. It's just not possible. I can't function as a businessman. I can't provide for my family without bribing the right people in the expected ways. You know, does that mean that, you know, I am in trouble with God? The same issue, right? The problem and the challenge of being good in an immoral system or society. I think a problem that maybe increasingly we are finding ourselves in as Christians, even in our own country today. But it's much more dramatic, isn't it, for those people in Gaza, you know, who, you know, maybe didn't support Hamas. And there they are being pulverized. And those, you know, people in Israel who don't agree with what their government's doing in Gaza, but, you know, their country had been attacked. They have, you know, fellow citizens who are hostages. I mean, what do they do with that? Iran is a real threat. How about Russian soldiers getting massacred in Ukraine, you know, because President Putin wants to conquer another country? How about Ukrainian civilians? How about the victims of those floods in Texas, right? There was a lot of kind of government kind of incompetence and corruption that meant that it didn't really, our response was not what it should have been. There's this challenge when we look at our history these days, right? You know, you look at it in history, you know, what was it like to be a good person in Nazi Germany? How could you be a good person in Soviet Russia? Or worse, the DDR, the East Germany, with the Stasi and files that they had on everybody. If you had the courage to, you know, act against that system, you know, you have a neighbor spying on you and reporting on you. And would you participate in that evil yourself? The Cultural Revolution in China. I had a student at St. James who asked to be baptized and confirmed, and he told me that his grandparents were Christians in China, and they were killed for that, which is why his parents sent him to St. James so that he could be a Christian and they could restore the faith in their family. Slavery in America. Is there such a thing as a good slave owner? This is a very lively debate. And you know, in most of mainstream liberal northeastern universities, like the one I went to, no, you can't. And I don't agree with that. I think you could. But it was a struggle. You know, and all that separate but not equal that followed slavery in America. You know, my parents, how did they function? You know, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, all of that in largely the sort of enlightened North, but nonetheless with lots of systemic inequality that, you know, people just kind of did their best to work around or to ignore. We are tempted to judge in retrospect, I think, personally, as an historian, too harshly, and to fail to appreciate the context of how people actually had to function in the past, and to appreciate their brave and quiet attempts to be good. We have a kind of simplistic, I would say kind of Calvinist view these days of victims and persecutors, the good guys and the bad guys, and the reality is a lot of the good struggled in between. And, you know, the life they lived, the challenges they faced, like the life we live, the lives we live, and the challenges we face are kind of more subtle than that. I would argue that George Washington was a good man. He founded our nation. He created the peaceful transfer of power. He refused to crown. We could have had a Simon de Bolivar and been a kind of a, you know, had that sort of government, and we didn't. And we have Washington to thank for that. Episcopalians, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I'm one, we have a lot to thank George Washington for. He saved our church because, you know, we were largely loyalists and they wanted to make us illegal. And he said, no, it's fine. There's this great line when Washington was at Trinity Wall Street, and Father Inglis was the rector who went on to be the Bishop of Nova Scotia, left with the Loyalists, and by the way, there were many of them. He led prayers for the king, and General Washington's lieutenant went up and objected because General Washington was present because the Revolutionary Army had just taken New York from the British, and he said, well, I have to pray for the king. I'm a priest of the Church of England. I took a vow to pray for the king. So the lieutenant went back to complain to Washington, and Washington said, he's right, he does. And besides, the king has much to be prayed for. So, think of the journey of George Wallace during civil rights, this vicious racist who became a kind of enlightened governor later on. Are we able to let him improve, or do we just condemn him? I once attended a talk from a famous African-American history professor and who is a great expert on the journey in civil rights at the Headmasters Conference in North Carolina. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, how come you guys never talk about Eisenhower? Because Eisenhower was a great civil rights president, right? Remember Little Rock? Remember how he desegregated the armed forces after Truman had resegregated it? Eisenhower did, some quiet good. And he told me, he said, you're right, we should. We just sort of see him in the wrong camp. But the reality is Eisenhower did a lot of good. He didn't just build those highways. He did play a lot of golf. In our own school's history, in St. James history, because we were founded in 1842, and we're 5 miles from Antietam Battlefield, and we're right where they marched, Jubal Early marched back and forth to Gettysburg. So, and when the Diocese of Maryland bought the estate that is now St. James School, there were slaves there. But we were always, they were freed pretty quickly, and Dr. Kerfert, is our great hero, our first rector. So we thought we were in the clear in this present sort of reevaluation moment that we're experiencing. And, but we discovered, or the historian, with a real bias, frankly, found out that Dr. Kerfert bought a woman and her 3 daughters. Ooh. That's one of those nights where I didn't sleep as headmaster. I thought, oh, good Lord. Our hero was a slave owner. But then our chaplain, who's African American, went to the registry, looked it up, and he saw that he freed that woman and her daughters, I think it was 5 years later, with them, but she had to pay him back because he had no money. But he writes, I have freed so-and-so, which was my intention when I bought them. So he was working within the system against the particular persecution of this good woman and her children. Does that make him a good man? I would say yes. Many would say no. Many these days. He should have, been a radical abolitionist, but the reason he wasn't was he was a good Episcopalian and didn't believe in revolting against the civil authority and engaging in acts of violence. See, I'm just trying to point out, it's kind of complicated, isn't it? It's not as easy as people like to think it is when they're talking about somebody else. It's complicated for me, but not for them. It's complicated for all of us. Think of the power of the Christ-inspired hero or heroine to challenge systemic evil and corruption and to respond actively to address what is wrong in society around them. Think of St. Francis of Assisi, who confronted the corruption of the Catholic Church and really challenged them to the return to the actual teachings of Christ, to embrace the poor and the leper and not just to accumulate great wealth and political power. Think of William Wilberforce, one of our own, who single-handedly initially, but then built a great movement to stop the slave trade in the British Empire. 30 years, before anything happened in America, and really, which went on to end slavery altogether. During the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain was, economically had every reason to keep the wealth from the sugar islands, Wilberforce convinced Parliament, an institution founded to preserve property, to act against the interests of property and greed and free these people. because of his faith, because he was a Christian. Think of Florence Nightingale, who went as a gentlewoman to nurse those soldiers suffering in Crimea. And the generals were, viewed women who helped the wounded as basically prostitutes. But she created a whole new model of Christian women acting as nurses to help and take better care of those who are wounded. And the actual results were huge. They used to assume that 3/4 would die once Florence Nightingale and her nurses showed up. Many of them Anglican nuns, the Sisters of the Holy Trinity amongst them. They changed that completely to, it was more like 60% survived. It's amazing. You can see the effect of their courage to be good. Dr. King in our own country. And the point of Dr. King being a Christian minister that I think people kind of forget is not only was it nonviolent, he also never condemned white people. He never said all those white people are racist. He never, ever did that. He called white people of good conscience and common faith to join him in his peaceful crusade because he was a Christian minister. John Paul II, who brought down communism in Europe basically by saying Mass in Poland. Just the power of his presence and his witness, and the Poles could see that their government was powerless to stop him, as millions gathered to worship the risen Christ with him in an atheistic communist state. Think of Mother Teresa and her courage living in and working and caring for the poor in Calcutta. And then let's go back to these floods in Texas. Normally when disasters happen in America, our media is all about the disaster. We all should be afraid it's coming, look out, right? And then, whose fault is it is a big part of it, and, and it's, generally somebody's fault. And then kind of the scale of it and how horrible it is, and then they kind of drop it, right? Isn't that usually how they do these stories? But did you notice this time they didn't get away with it? They had to talk about those little girls, right, on that bus singing hymns on their way back from camp, driving out of their camp, or that college-age counselor who saved the girls in her cabin, or that man whose wife and 2 daughters had died in a flood somewhere else, who then volunteered to come to Texas to work and find the dead bodies of those and heal the families because he knew what it was like. And he was remarried, he had a daughter, and he had to explain to his daughter that he will be gone, and he didn't know when he would come back. And the reporter asked him, well, how did she respond? And he said, she understood. She understood. Think back, do you remember the Mother Emanuel story? Do you remember that horrible racist shooter who went in there and massacred those people in their church, for heaven's sakes? Remember that? And everybody was, and it was like, the media are just like third graders in the hall, like, fight, they're going to have a fight, let's see the fight. But there was no fight. You know why there was no fight? Those people in that church forgave him. They had the Christian courage to forgive him. And the media had no idea what to do with that. I don't know. And you remember that next Sunday when all the parishes and churches in Charleston, South Carolina came to Mother Emanuel to worship with them? And I have family in Charleston, and I can tell you it's a pretty segregated church scene down there. But, they all came, the Episcopalians behind our crosses and, our tapers and, down to join them. Blocks were full of Christians worshiping together in faith and in admiration. Do you remember when Jesus is feeding the multitude? Do you remember what he tells his disciples when he says, they say, Lord, all these people need to eat, and we don't have any food for them. Shall we send them away? That's their response. Remember what Jesus says to them? You feed them. That's what he says to us. That's the part of the disaster stories that the media so often drop. The brave and generous response of the victim who refuses to be a victim, and the stranger who becomes the neighbor, and the neighbor who helps, right? You know, that's the resurrection that comes in response to the passion in the story that begins the Easter story for all of us. The power that God gives to all of us if we will follow him as we see him in the life and witness and teachings of Jesus Christ to heal and to help. And going back to what I said at the beginning, this is what Christ teaches us to pray for, not to get from God what we want. Oh Lord, please give me another fancy car. Give me a bigger house. Give me another big house. Help me to, beat out these other people and win this, No, that's not Christian prayer. Not to get from God what we want, but to be for God what he wants. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, not my kingdom, but God's kingdom. And thereby to gain, that purpose and that power that comes from joining in the love of God for all people and all creation. To be, for him, that person for others. Empowered as we are to serve in his transforming and redeeming purposes of love. But this requires us to forgive other people that upset us and to get over ourselves, right? I love that phrase, just build a bridge and get over it. We have to do that ourselves. And to reach out, to feel, not to feel sorry for ourselves as bitter, permanent victims, but to get over it. And to see others beyond our family or our social circle or party or church or race or country, not as strangers and proven, or potential enemies, but as neighbors in need and future friends. To lose this we and they attitude which divides us these days, and embrace the whole of the family and the promise of God revealed to us in Jesus Christ. To care about others and not just ourselves. To do our best to understand and to help them with all the gifts that God has given us generously and bravely, because generosity requires courage. Like those volunteers in Texas. And all those Christian heroes and heroines and saints before and around us, to shine the light of Christ in the midst of the darkness of every tragedy and before every evil which confronts us. Always remember what Jesus said to his disciples. You do it.